Welcome, everybody, for another interesting, I hope, episode of Mondays with Mundy. That's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation at the Union League of Philadelphia. For the last couple of weeks, we've been following previous American presidential elections and the League, because as you may recall, the League was a Republican organization at this point in time. In our first episode, we talked about this kind of identity crisis that happened in 1892 when Grover Cleveland was elected for the second time, and a number of League members supported him. The response from the League was to try and insert the words Republican Club in the bylaws. The membership turned that down, but they did pass a resolution stating that the League was a distinctly Republican organization and that members should follow the principles of the Republican Party. So all was going along smoothly until the 1920 election, when it turns out that a very prominent League member named John Jacob Raskob, who at that point was the Vice President of Finance and the Treasurer for both the I.E. DuPont Company and General Motors Corporation, kind of jumped ship and became the chairman of the Democratic National Committee and helped bankroll the presidential candidacy of the Democratic candidate, Alfred E. Smith. Okay, well, the League survived that one too. So now it's 1932, and the stakes are a little bigger, right? Because there's something called prohibition, the 18th Amendment, and it is going to become an issue. And let's find out why. Okay, all right. So that means I'm going to go to a PowerPoint. So if you guys will let me share the screen. Okay, we're getting there. Yep. Okay, we got it. It worked. Okay, so this is politics in the American presidential elections at the League, Part 3. So again, 1932. The candidates are Republican Herbert Hoover, the incumbent, right, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democrat, governor of New York, running for the first time. All right, so let's see what's going on. So here we have Raymond Pitcairn. And if you know the Pitcairns, you'll automatically think of Pittsburgh plate glass, founded by Raymond's father, John, in basically Pittsburgh, suburban Pittsburgh, in the 19th century. It was one of the country's largest producers and manufacturers of plate glass, paints, coatings, varnishings, and things like that. Raymond wasn't involved in the management, but rather he was a lawyer on his own, and a lifelong Republican, and a member of the League. His foil, shall we say, is going to be this gentleman, E. Lawrence Fell. Mr. Fell was a printer by profession. He owned the Franklin Printing Company for just under 30 years, and he was the president of the League in 1932, when things got a little interesting, to say the least. So what was going on? What's the conflict? Let's take a look. Okay. Pitcairn asked to resign from Union League. All right. Club's head suggests wet leader would feel uncomfortable. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the Union League demands the resignation of Pitcairn. I don't know if demands is quite appropriate, but they certainly was suggested. So, and by the way, the Philadelphia Record was a Democratic-leaning paper, and the Ledger was Republican-leaning. So let me, in this case, I normally don't read something, but I think I'm going to in this case. I think it'll help make things a little clearer. So this is from a newspaper article, and this one's from the Evening Bulletin, and we're looking at Thursday, November the 3rd. Now, in 1932, the election took place on November the 8th, so this was the week before the election. Okay? All right. So this is Mr. Fell wrote a letter to Mr. Pitcairn, and this is what he said. I saw it stated in newspapers that you are actively supporting the Democratic candidate for Congress in your district, and that you have stated you will vote for him and also the Democratic candidate for president. I hope these statements are unfounded. While, of course, it is your privilege to forsake the Republican Party and transfer your allegiance to another political party, I feel I should remind you that the Union League of Philadelphia is a Republican organization. And when you applied for membership, you stated in writing that you are a Republican in national politics. And we saw that in the last episode on Mr. Raskob's membership application. All right? If you have changed political parties and are no longer a Republican, I would assume that you would feel very uncomfortable in remaining a member of the Union League and would desire to withdraw to make a vacancy for one of the several hundred Republican candidates who were waiting to be elected to membership. Pretty straightforward stuff, isn't it? All right. You joined as a Republican. Now you're switching parties to vote for the Democratic candidate. And believe me, and as we said before, nothing was more important to the Union League than the American presidential election, because the Republican Party platform supported the tariff, a protective tariff, that was charged against European manufactured goods. And Philadelphia at this point, while it's no longer the industrial machine it had been in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was still a major industrial city. And therefore, it was still in the city's economic self-interest to be Republican. And Philadelphia was, at this point, still the only Republican city in the country. And I cannot overestimate that enough. And the Union League was the most Republican organization in the country. And Pennsylvania was the most Republican state in the country. So this is life and death stuff here, folks. I mean, this really is. So what did Mr. Pitcairn say in return? Well, let's find out. Okay. I'm sure he said, "My dear sir, I have been a registered Republican ever since I cast my first ballot. I have always voted for a Republican presidential candidate until President Hoover bound the Republican Party to the support of the 18th Amendment, and by his persistent dry leadership, made it a party of national prohibition." Pretty straightforward. Yes, it is true that this year I shall vote for the Democratic candidate for president. And there he's saying it right there. He's going to vote for FDR. All right. Interesting stuff, all because of alcohol. And now, on top of that, now it gets a little better, if you will. So this is Pitcairn writing to Fell again. "I made every effort to induce the Union League to go on record against the 18th Amendment in accordance with the overwhelming majority sentiment of its membership." I would think that Pitcairn is right on that one, knowing the League. "I hope that united action by the Union League, favoring repeal, represented forcefully and openly to the administration in Washington, might demonstrate the necessity of a change in our party stand, which would bring it into line with public opinion and save it from defeat." Well spoken, or well written. And I'll get to that in a minute. So Mr. Pitcairn ends his letter by saying, "I note your suggestion that I withdraw from membership in the League. In this matter, I shall be guided by the wishes of a majority of our members, and I respectfully request that you will take steps to determine their views. May I request that steps be taken in this direction as soon as possible, so that I may make room for one of your candidates immediately if action should prove adverse." So here we go, back and forth. Interesting. Now, just so you know, Pitcairn didn't resign. And everybody lived happily ever after. And Pitcairn himself, though, was actually a fairly conservative Republican. He belonged to something called the Seminoles of the Democracy. And it was very much right of center. Pitcairn was an avowed enemy of the New Deal, which is what the Sentinels were all about. So it's not like Pitcairn is this liberal Republican. I mean, just the opposite. So it's interesting that this one issue would become so important to him in this one election. So how did the election go itself? It's 1932, all right? So Hoover was the incumbent. Roosevelt, we know, was the incoming or the Democratic nominee, and Roosevelt walloped Hoover. 472 electoral votes for Roosevelt, 59 for Hoover, the opposite of what he had done previously, what Hoover had done to Alfred E. Smith in 1928, pretty much reverse. Only 6 states voted for Hoover in 1932: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, the only major state in the country that went Republican, as I mentioned. So again, you kind of get the feel for how Republican Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the League were at this point in time, and how this was very important to them. So that was that. Everybody lived happily ever after. Well, no, that's not true. The Republicans lost, and they weren't happy about that. And we'll get to that next. So what happens next? This gentleman, Robert Otto Heiligman, right? He was a judge on the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia. He was elected president of the Union League in December of 1935. And at the annual Lincoln Day, at this point, dinner, February the 12th, 1936, Heiligman made a pronouncement. And this one, again, I'm going to read if that's okay, because I couldn't convey the language. I mean, I want to get the language right. So, all right, this is what the judge said to an audience of approximately 800 members having dinner at the League that night. Okay. We have some half Republicans and some Democrats in this club as members, he said. All right. If you will bring to the notice of the president any such members, I have my eyes on a couple and I'll have my hands on them soon. All right. I will personally deliver the message to them. There will be no pussyfooting during this administration. Yikes, here we go again. It's like they're fighting for the heart and soul of the League. And what's going to happen? Okay, pretty much nothing. Now, keep in mind that the city, which had only had 2 Democratic mayors between 1858 and 1952, all right? So the city is slowly becoming more Democratic. The Democratic Party, which had been pretty much in the back pocket of the Republican Party for all those years, if not decades, Democrats are feeling their oats now. And so in the 1935 mayoral election, the Democrats ran a guy named John B. Kelly. And most everybody knows John B. Kelly as 2 things. One, an Olympic rower, 1920 and 1924, but perhaps most importantly, as the father of Princess Grace Kelly, married Prince Rainier of Monaco. So Kelly at this point, though, he's a self-made Irish Catholic, second generation Irish. His parents were both from Ireland. He built up his brick construction company, Kelly for Brickwork. All right. And Kelly's going to go against S. Davis Wilson, who was, just to give him a comparison to something we can understand today, a bit Trumpian in the sense that Trump was a Democrat, became a Republican. Davis was a Democrat who became a Republican. He supported Roosevelt in 1932, and here he is running for mayor as Republican in 1935. Now, the Republicans still really controlled the city itself in terms of the city's offices, the mayor and all the different row offices. And in that election, Davis would win, but only by approximately 50,000 votes. And that was the smallest margin yet in the 20th century. So the Democrats were surging up. And what was the result? Now, so the Democrats they won they lost the mayoral election, but they're going to win the presidential election. And Kelly at this point had made a boast that if Roosevelt would win, he would give a speech off the portico of the Union League of Philadelphia itself. All right. So what happened? Let's take a look. All right. This is the night of November the 3rd of 1936. Roosevelt crushed Alf Landon. I mean, crushed. It was kind of like McGovern losing in 1972, where he only won one state. It was just, it was awful. All right. By midnight, there were approximately 15,000 people in front of the League House. And unfortunately, I couldn't find an illustration this time, but usually in the front of the League House, maybe remember from the last episode, it had this big electric sign. And in this case, it would have said, Alf Landon was running for president in 1936. So Landon, Love of Country leads, big electric lights and stuff like that. And somehow Heiligman was just absolutely, positively sure that Roosevelt was going to get defeated and that Landon would win. Wishful thinking, all right? Because, again, Roosevelt just ran right over Landon like he had run over Hoover 4 years before. And so here's John B. Kelly. Now, as you can imagine, the League had heard about this boast, and so there were a number of off-duty policemen standing on the steps to keep any from going up the steps. The League had turned out all the lights, and at one point they had even turned out the Landon and Love of Country lead lights. So the front of the house is completely dark. So John B. Kelly arrives a little after midnight, and he couldn't get up the steps, so the crowd literally hoisted him over the front baluster of the portico itself, where a League doorman tried to stop Kelly from giving a speech, which didn't last more than 15 or 20 seconds from what I understand or what I can read. And that was the end of it. So now, there you go. So politics haven't been quite as contentious, at least American presidential politics, at least not in the League and not in Philadelphia in many ways since then. But here's a good example, though, of how, the League, as I said earlier, its DNA was just built into the Republican Party itself. And so the League was always fighting to support it. Now, eventually, in 1976, the League would eliminate the requirement that candidates for membership vote Republican in American presidential elections, because they realized there weren't enough young Republican candidates for membership who wanted to join the League by 1976. So since then, the League has been technically apolitical or non-political. So we now have Democratic members and Republican members, and things aren't quite the same they were, but they weren't maybe as much fun. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion down our political presidential memory lane. But it gives you a new insight into the League, but into the city, and into American presidential politics as well. So thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. And by the way, this is being broadcast on Monday, November the 2nd, for the first time at least, the day before our next American presidential election. So everybody, do what makes this country different from every other country. Vote. You have the vote. Get out and do it. All right? So thanks for joining us. Thanks to the Legacy Foundation for sponsoring these episodes. They're a lot of fun. I hope you're enjoying them. And it's still crazy out there, so stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.